Hello, my name is Dominic Reisig. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist, North Carolina State University Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. This presentation is intended for winter commodity meetings during 2018. It's covering issues that we had in soybeans in 2017 with a look forward to this year. The theme of today's presentation is going to be integrated pest management, scouting, identifying, and treating at the proper thresholds. Looking at this field, can you tell what the problem is? And I'm looking across it, I see a pretty good canopy, see maybe some holes in the tops of the leaves, maybe there's some bean leaf beetle present, but I really have to go out in the field and investigate if I want to find out what the problem is. When I look down in the canopy, I don't notice any apparent problem, and it's really not until I actually get down into the canopy itself that I notice that our major insect pest of the state, corn earworm, has been there. And this can only be identified using scouting. If this is something you're not capable of doing yourself, we have fantastic consultants in scout in this state, and I suggest that you get one. This is a problem that should have been avoided in the past. You notice the earworms have already fed on the seed, they've dropped in the soil, they've pupated, and they're gone. This problem should have been identified and taken care of when the insects were small, before they had a chance to cause this potential yield loss. What pests were important during 2017? Well, we've been keeping records officially since 2011, but if you look back at the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, corn earworm has nearly always been our top insect in terms of losses and costs. And this is a result of all the corn that we have in our system. Now, I'm not picking on one commodity. If we eliminated all the corn out of our system, Dr. Rob Stinner, a former North Carolina state entomologist, estimated that our earworm numbers would drop by 97%. But of course, if we eliminated corn from the system, who knows what would take over its place in soybeans besides the corn earworm. One of the themes of this presentation today is that I want us to think about a systems level approach. When we think about soybeans, we have to not just think about soybeans, but we have to think about the other crops in the system. And as we'll see later on in the presentation, corn earworm is a problem because of corn. But in soybeans, it cost us around $48.9 million in 2017. Our second yield-limiting pest was stink bugs, followed by soybean looper. These three insects have been in the top three since 2012. It was upset in 2011 when we had drought and saw losses from lesser cornstalk borer, but these are typically our top three yield-limiting insects. Sometimes soybean looper takes more than stink bugs. So my prediction in 2018 is corn earworms, stink bugs, and soybean loopers are going to be our top three issues. Our number 4 issue is something we can take care of this year, and that's automatic sprays. I estimated that we put on about $2.64 an acre in automatic sprays. Now, I'm not much of a deer hunter. I get up in the stand a few times a year and take a doe and eat the meat. But I do know that when you take a shot, it's always best to take a deep breath, aim, and carefully squeeze the trigger and make sure you don't flinch and close your eyes. These automatic sprays are essentially flinching and closing our eyes when we're taking a shot. Our odds of hitting the right pest at the right time are pretty low. Whereas if we're a little bit more careful, if we scout and use those thresholds, we can be a lot better off. We can avoid dumping this money down the drain. Bean leaf beetle and three-cornered alfalfa hopper are important pests. These typically enter our top 6 and did cause us some problems this year. But again, our top 3 are corn earworm, stink bugs, and soybean loopers. Our thresholds are based on sampling, and at least for 2 of our top pests, corn earworms or stink bugs, they're based on using either the sweep net or the drop cloth method. There's no other way you can use these thresholds other than using a sweep net or a drop cloth. If you have a consultant, they are using one of these or perhaps something called a rigid beat sheet. These can be purchased fairly inexpensively online. See me if you need to know how to get one. The sweep net is a really good tool for narrow or wide row soybeans. The drop cloth is essentially a wide row soybean sampling method. Maybe you can squeeze it into 20-inch soybeans, but really 30 inches or larger is where this thing really shines. But it varies by row spacing and what insect you're trying to count. So corn earworm, our top insect pest, we have thresholds based on both the sweep net and the drop cloth, and we have a pretty good idea of what corn earworm is going to do in our state. These are light trap data from 1993 to 2016, so this is the average of what happened over those 23 years. We typically have 4 generations of this insect in our state throughout the year. They emerge from overwintering in March and April. You can sort of see those little blips on the line down there. and they come out of their first generation from early corn and non-crop hosts sometime around the end of June. We mainly see corn earworm in our state from late July through mid-September. Our largest generation comes out of corn, and that happens sometime around the end of July, and that's the generation that we see going into soy. They develop on corn, cotton, and soy later on in the season. We really don't know what happens much with that fourth generation. A lot of those insects are actually in the soil overwintering, but some of those insects can undergo that fourth generation on some other hosts as well. But even though we have this average and we sort of can predict what's going to happen from year to year, no year is the same. These are the light trap data from 2017. We saw our early peak out of corn in late July, early August, but we saw essentially very little activity in mid-August like we typically see. We did see that later peak. So it's very, very important that we identify what's going on by scouting. What if you said, well, we see our corn earworm peak here, late July, beginning August. I'm going to put on my automatic spray here. You'd have missed the boat. You should have put it on way earlier. Again, this can only be identified through proper scouting. It's important to keep in mind what's going on with the plant. When we think about applying our thresholds, we have to remember that they're a guide, and we have to remember that each season and each field is going to differ. You have to think about, is this a full season bean? Is this a double crop bean? Do I have an indeterminate plant or do I have a determinate plant? What's the planting date? All these things can affect how the plant grows and how the plant is able to compensate and whether or not it's attractive to insects. For the purpose of earworms, we really like to focus in on the R1 stage. This is typically when the insect likes to come in, lay its eggs in the plant, so that those larvae can develop on those flowers before moving to the pods, which are developing the seed. Those small instar larvae have a very difficult time penetrating large pods with large seeds inside of them. This year we did see some insects in vegetative soybeans, and that just goes to show you that although the insect prefers laying eggs in flowering soybeans, if the moths are out there and there's no other host in the environment, they're going to lay their eggs where food's available, whether or not it's the best food for their offspring or not. Our thresholds can be found at soybeans.ces.ncsu.edu, and if you visit what we call our soybean portal and you go to the sidebar, you'll see a place for insect management and you'll find our thresholds there. Our thresholds are really well established for potting stage soybean. As I mentioned before, the typical pattern is these insects move in during flowering, lay eggs, the small larvae develop on flowers, and then they move on to the pods. Sometimes these insects can consume significant amounts of flowers. We do not have a good flowering stage threshold established, and there's a good reason for that. Soybean Producers Association funded a student several years ago. The student was trying to develop a flowering stage threshold. She created a situation that was 3 times the potting stage threshold. I mean, there were a lot of earworms in these plots. Didn't make a bit of difference in terms of yield. That plant puts on 80–90% more flowers than it can use. These earworms consume those flowers. It really wasn't a problem. The plant at this point in the season could just make pods that have more seeds, or perhaps it can make pods that have seeds that are heavier. However, we did see one case where corn earworm did cause a yield loss, and the interesting thing about this case was the numbers were well below the potting stage threshold. This was a very stressed situation, and I think the plant just wasn't able to compensate for that flowering loss that it received from the earworm. So I think it's really important to take into account the environmental conditions, the canopy, the growth stage of the soybeans, the planting date. Is that plant going to be able to compensate for that flowering loss that it's receiving from the earworm? I want to transition now to talk a little bit about insecticide choice. My colleague Dr. Sally Taylor at Virginia Tech was able to do some bioassays using a pyrethroid this year. And what she did was she collected earworms from different locations. Some of these were in North Carolina, some of these were in Virginia, and these were from different sources. Some were from corn, some were from soybean, one was from sorghum, and then we had a lab colony. These columns here are the LD50 and the LD90, and I'm going to focus in on the LD50 for the purposes of this presentation. The LD50 is an important point because it tells us the point at which 50% of the insects are killed by a particular dose of the insecticide. So if we have a low LD50, that means that very little of the insecticide is needed to kill 50% of that population. They're pretty susceptible. If it's higher, that means that more of that insecticide is needed to kill 50% of the population. They're more resistant. And you notice that with this lab colony, she wasn't even able to establish an LD50. All the insects died at 1 part per million of this pyrethroid. I want to focus in on two cases here. One is in Gates, North Carolina, and the other is in Suffolk, Virginia. And if you look at the LD50 of Gates, it's around 3 parts per million compared to the LD50 from Suffolk, which is around 22 parts per million. These counties are adjacent in North Carolina and Virginia. They're not very far apart geographically, but it would take over 7 times more insecticide to kill 50% of the population at Suffolk than it would at Gates. Now, Sally also did a couple insecticide trials at these locations. So we're going to look first at the Gates County one, which should be more susceptible to pyrethroids. Pyrethroids should be able to kill them a little bit better. These results here are in terms of percent control. So if we have a very effective insecticide, we'd expect it to fall over on this end, almost 100% control. If we have a less effective insecticide, we'd expect it to fall over on this side of the graph. Let's look at our pyrethroids first. We have Warrior 2, or Karate. We have Brigade, which is bifenthrin, and we have Baythroid. And you notice that there's a range in how these insecticides work, but none of these pyrethroids performed exceptionally. I want us now to look a little bit more at the caterpillar-specific insecticides. We have Intrepid Edge, we have Prevathon, we have Steward, and we have Besiege. And you notice that even among our caterpillar-specific insecticides, we have a range of efficacy in these populations. And, you know, to be honest, in some cases, 50% control might be acceptable. Let's say you have a population that's just bumping up against threshold. If you killed 50% of them, hey, maybe that's good. Maybe 50% of them is all you need to get. Well, what if you're 2 or 3 times the threshold? Is 50% going to be acceptable then? So for my money, I would rather our growers go with some of these more consistent insecticides. All right, let's look at this next population. Keep in mind, this was a population where it took 7 times more pyrethroid to kill 50% of the population than it did at Gates County. So again, this is percent control. We actually have an insecticide that was 100%, Besiege at 6 ounces. And then we have one on the low end, Asana, which is a pyrethroid. Asana, Warrior 2, Baythroid XL, Brigade, these are all pyrethroids, and these are all falling out at around 50% control or worse in this trial. All of our caterpillar-specific insecticides are falling out at 50% or better, but again, there's a range in here. The diamoids performed very strong in this trial. Prevathon, Besiege, at different rates, offering nearly 100% control. I would like growers to move completely away from pyrethroids. There's too much inconsistency out there. I want them to focus in on some of the caterpillar-specific insecticides. Prevathon and Besiege look very good. How do you distinguish between those two insecticides? I think it's going to depend on if you need the pyrethroid present in the Besiege or not. So Besiege is Prevathon plus a pyrethroid. Sometimes that pyrethroid can help us. It can help us pick up stink bugs. It can help us pick up bean leaf beetles. Sometimes that pyrethroid can hurt us. It can knock out beneficial insects that we may need later in the season. We have a really good example coming up with soybean loopers, so hang on for that. Before we talk about soybean loopers, I want to talk about our number 2 pest for the year, stink bugs. And stink bugs are somewhat predictable because they move across the landscape in different crops throughout the year. Whether it's a green stink bug, southern green stink bug, or brown stink bug, they have 2 generations a year in North Carolina. These are some data generated from a colleague of mine in Georgia, but they're very similar to what we see in North Carolina. And what they did was they tracked these things in different crops throughout the season. This is the number of adult brown stink bugs per sample. And typical to what we see, they saw a lot of stink bugs in corn in June. Mid-season, they were in a bunch of different crops, but primarily cotton and soybeans. And then they were really only present in soybeans later season. But notice that that took place, at least in Georgia, anywhere from August all the way through November. And this is what makes managing stink bugs in soybeans so difficult, because at some point in the season, corn's getting harvested, cotton's getting harvested. The only crop that these insects have left to move into is soybeans, and they are going to pass their second generation in that crop. Soybeans are difficult to manage because any one grower may have a range of planting dates and a range of maturity groups present. So scouting soybeans for stink bugs is really an extended problem. But it's very important that we do scout soybeans even when we're busy with other things on the farm. These are some photos from the southern part of our state in 2017. and notice the characteristic green stem syndrome. Green stem is caused by some sort of stress on the plant, and that stress interferes with reproduction in some way. So it could be a stink bug, it could be drought, it could be wetness, something like that. But the plant is essentially staying green to try and compensate for that reproductive loss. How do we know this is stink bugs? Well, we can look at the characteristic shriveled seed on the left. That stink bug maybe hit those soybeans sometime during R5, R6, interfered with it, trying to fill out that seed to touch the pod walls, or maybe it took place during R6, R7. You can notice the lesion on the seed itself. You can see that little bit of wateriness. That's those pathogens that those stink bugs are transmitting in on their beaks. So it's important to think about the direct yield loss that they might cause from interfering with the seed, destroying the pod, and also even when the pods are formed and the seeds are filling weight, some of the pathogens that they can transmit. Notice the seed in the top here that has mold growing on it. Maybe a stink bug transmitted that into the pod. It's important to distinguish species when we look at stink bugs and we sample them. We can lump southern greens and greens in together, and the reason we can do that is because they're very susceptible to pyrethroids, and we don't really have to be careful about which one we use. Green stink bug nymphs, as southern green stink bug nymphs, to me sort of have more of a rounded shape as a nymph. In contrast, brown stink bug nymphs have more of an oval shape. They may have a little bit of green coloration as well, but it's important that we tell the browns from the greens because we need to use bifenthrin for these stink bugs. It's more effective insecticide. It's a special type of pyrethroid that we really want to save for those brown stink bugs. In addition to getting our species right, it's really important that we distinguish among growth stages when we manage stink bugs. R4 is when we have full pod, R5 is when seeds are just starting to form, and R6 is when those seeds are touching the pod wall. And that's so important because a series of studies from the Mid-Atlantic recently showed that feeding at R4 was more serious than at R6. Why would that be the case? When we think about R4, when we have full pod, what's the plant trying to do? It's trying to put a seed into that pod. What's the stink bug trying to do? It's trying to feed where all the goodies are going, and all the goodies from that plant are going into forming that seed. So the stink bug's destroying that seed as it's forming. At R6, the seed's already filled out. The stink bug is feeding on the seed itself, so the stink bug is feeding on maybe some of the oils that are trying to go into the seed, or some of the protein, or maybe it's transmitting some pathogens, but it's not actually destroying the seed. So we know that it's more important to protect those soybeans early on. We really need to scout and treat all the way from R3 to R7. As I mentioned before, given our range of planting dates, given our range of maturities, this is a very difficult thing to do, but it's something that we need to do if we're going to protect this crop from stink bugs. We have great established thresholds, and they depend on those two different sampling methods. The sweep net is 5 and 15 sweeps. The drop cloth is 1 per row foot. The sweep net threshold is for both wide and narrow rows at this time because we assume that you're covering the same amount of foliage with a sweep. And we can probably relax these thresholds somewhat at R7. When you think about that time, the plant is maturing, they're not causing a whole lot of direct yield loss. They may be causing some quality issues. So we do have some good thresholds for stink bugs, but again, we need to be very careful about scouting through that extended period. Finally, I want to talk about soybean loopers, our number 3 in terms of cost and control this year. And I want to start out with just some general treatment tips for soybean loopers, some things that are important to keep in mind if we're going to manage this pest correctly. I think the primary thing to keep in mind is that this is a migratory insect, and it's coming in later in the season. And that's important because this insect generally shows up around the 1st of September, and by that time in the season we may have already put a broad spectrum insecticide on our soybean crop. So we may have gone in there and sprayed a pyrethroid for bean leaf beetle, or maybe we had to treat some kudzu bugs or stink bugs or something like that. That's fine and dandy, and I'm sure it controlled the pest at hand, but the other thing it's done is probably eliminated natural enemies from the system. And so if you're a soybean looper moth and you're dropping in to a soybean field with no natural enemies there's a pretty good chance that your offspring are going to survive. And so we really need to avoid those broad spectrum insecticides unless they're needed. It's also important that we identify the pest correctly. So soybean loopers can be easily confused with green cloverworm. They're both green, they both loop. You have to count these back legs here. We have a scouting guide that'll tell you how to do that. But just briefly, look for these 3 back legs here. Green cloverworms have 4 legs on the back. It's also important that we strike a balance between larval size and defoliation. So the past two thresholds we talked about for both stink bugs and corn earworm are based on the sweep net, beat cloth. Those are direct sampling methods. We're actually counting the insects that are out there. For soybean loopers, we recommend a defoliation threshold, as we do for all of our defoliating insects. If the plants are 30% defoliated before flowering, we recommend a spray. If they're 15% defoliated after flowering, we recommend a spray. That's a little bit difficult in terms of control with a soybean looper for two reasons. One is you have an insect that begins feeding on the bottom of the canopy and then moves its way up. So in order to estimate defoliation, you really need to part the canopy and figure out, does that plant really need those leaves on the bottom or does it not? Do I have that 3 foot of canopy that Dr. Dunphy tells me I need in order for the soybean plant to yield properly? And the other reason is that large instar larvae are difficult to kill. And if we let larvae get any sort of size and just kind of wait, well, I haven't hit defoliation yet, I haven't hit defoliation yet, you may wake up one day and you may have a big giant soybean looper that's very difficult to kill. And in addition, that big caterpillar eats most of the foliage right near the end of its life. So you may have a problem and not be able to take care of it. So it's important to keep in mind that while we do have these defoliation thresholds, we also need to go out there, sample the crop, and really focus on treating those small caterpillars when they're out there. We need to figure out, well, are there enough caterpillars out there to cause the defoliation that I need to treat, or are there not? It's very important to focus on insecticide penetration. As I just mentioned, these insects feed on the bottom of the canopy. We have some very tall canopies out there, some very lush canopies sometimes. Insecticide penetration is critical. And then finally, we need to choose the correct insecticide and proper rate. There is a soybean looper population somewhere in the US at any given time that is resistant to almost any given insecticide that is out there. These insects are very good at developing insecticide resistance. And I'm going to transition right into some of our results from this year that demonstrate that. This is from my colleague, Dr. Sally Taylor. We've seen some of her data before, and these are data on soybean looper from Virginia this year, and she's got it broken out into 16 and 15 days after treatment. I want to focus now on the results from 6 days after treatment, and those are in the blue bars. Not too surprising, our highest numbers are in the untreated 6 days after treatment, but besiege 6 days after treatment. What's going on there? Well, besiege is a combination of Prevathon, which is a diamide, and a pyrethroid. We've known for years that soybean loopers are resistant to pyrethroids, so that shouldn't be a surprise. But what's going on with the Prevathon? We've also noted some diamide resistance in North Carolina over the past year. So I think what's going on here is we probably have a combination of pyrethroids knocking out natural enemies and diamide resistance. And so, you know, maybe it's killing some of those insects, but without the beneficial insects there, it's not having much effect. Bifenthrin, which is a pyrethroid, was not very effective. Diamond at 8 ounces didn't look too good at 6 days after treatment. Well, that actually is not too surprising because it's an insect growth regulator and it arrests molting. So we have to give that insecticide some time to work. Then we go down to Prevathon here, which is the diamide portion of Besiege. Those sort of look middle of the road along with Intrepid Edge, Radiant, Blackhawk, and the most effective insecticides in this trial were Steward and Radiant at 6 days after treatment. Okay, now let's focus at 15 days after treatment, looking at the orange bars. What didn't separate out from the untreated? Diamond, Prevathon, Intrepid Edge, Radiant, Blackhawk, Steward, Radiant. Well, that's not very surprising. We oftentimes see these populations crash after we put out insecticide trials. And one of the ways that these trials crash is through the use of natural enemies. Well, what was actually higher than the untreated at 15 days after treatment? It was Besiege and Bifenthrin. The common thing between both of these insecticides is they had a pyrethroid. We knocked out natural enemies in this trial, and the populations were able to rebound as a result. Very important, if we need the pyrethroid portion of this Besiege, put it out. When do you need it? Stink bugs, kudzu bugs, bean leaf beetles. These are soybean looper screening results from Chowan County 7 days after treatment, and there's just a couple things I want to point out with this trial. First of all, with the diamide resistance that we've been seeing, our recommendation has been to spray Intrepid Edge because we've had more consistent results with it. This year was the first time I've really seen a significant rate response between 4 and 5 ounces, but the 5 ounces did look better than 4. So it's important that when we do put our insecticides that we're putting on those labeled rates, and with soybean loopers that we're trending towards the higher rates. If you look at the insecticide labels of almost any insecticide, Soybean looper will be broken out and will almost always have a higher rate recommended compared to the other insecticides. The second thing I want to point out is that while we do have pyrethroid resistance, it was a little bit inconsistent in this trial. So Brigade at 2.6 ounces actually looked pretty good. Well, that's a pyrethroid bifenthrin. Brigade plus Intrepid Edge looked terrible. What's going on here? The thing you see with insecticide resistance is often inconsistency. So I don't think that the pyrethroid worked well in this trial. I think that in this case it was probably just knocking out natural enemies here and maybe it wasn't there. Let's keep in mind that these are small plot trials and insecticide performance can vary in a commercial field. In conclusions, we need to take a systems level approach. When we're thinking about soybean insect control, it's important to think about what's going on in corn. It's important to think about what's going on in cotton. Where are those stink bugs moving from? Where are those corn earworms coming from? Where are those soybean loopers coming from? There's just no substitute for scouting and treating a threshold because you're not putting on unneeded insecticide. And finally, we have to choose the right insecticide for the right insect. If you're going to use a premixed product, make sure you need all the insecticides that are present in that premix at the rates that they're present in those premix. I think we do this for these 3 insects, and I think we oftentimes do a good job with this. Now I want to take a minute just to show you the danger of what happens when we don't use IPM. And this has happened with insecticidal seed treatments in soybeans. Now we've only been keeping records since 2011 in North Carolina, but in Mississippi they've been keeping records with 2004. And the common thing that our 2 states have, at least in terms of adoption of insecticidal seed treatments, is increasing over time. The other thing we have in common is tobacco thrips resistance to these insecticides. That appeared in 2011 in Mississippi, that appeared in 2014 in North Carolina. This is an insect that occurs in common between both cotton and soybeans. These are injury ratings on cotton. If they're a 1, there was no injury. If they're a 5, they're totally dead. And I've broken out these insecticide treatments into those that had a seed treatment alone and those that had a seed treatment with an additional insecticide. The red dotted line that you're seeing here represents the point at which we think that injury is going to lead to something that's going to cause an economic loss. So anything that's above that line is maybe going to have an economic penalty. Anything that's below that line, it's not going to have an economic penalty at all. Where do those treatments that just have the seed treatment alone group out? They're all above that line. We had to actually add additional insecticide to that seed treatment to get them below that line. So the cost of resistance here is that although we have resistance in soybeans, it's causing us problems in cotton because we're having to add more insecticide and we're increasing more resistance. We're actually burning out these insecticides when we have them. We now have direct evidence, thanks to a new entomologist here on our faculty, Dr. Anders Huseth. We have great direct evidence that says where we have soybeans, we have more resistance. Where we have cotton, we have more resistance. Where we have soybeans and cotton, we have more resistance. Resistance in soybeans is causing us problems in cotton. It's not just a single crop problem, it's a systems level problem. And to top it all off, we really don't need these insecticides in soybeans at all. We've had about 30 tests where we can eliminate thrips out of soybeans. We never see a yield advantage. This is published information. There's never been a single replicated university trial in the Southeast that has shown a yield advantage to using insecticidal seed treatments in soybeans. We don't need them. Yet we're still putting them on our crops. We're driving resistance in cotton as a result. I've even been hearing about problems in tobacco. So this is a situation where IPM is really falling flat on its face and we're paying the cost as a result. I want to end today with a photo of my son. His name's Graham, he's 3 years old. In 2016, when he was 2 years old, he had strep throat 7 times. It was maddening. The only symptom he would have would be he would vomit and act irritable. So I'd get a call from the daycare, your son's throwing up, you got to pick him up. Couldn't figure out what was wrong. Eventually we figured out whenever he throws up, take him to the doctor, he has strep throat, get him on antibiotics, he's good to go. After 7 times, I was ready to stick that kid on antibiotics nonstop. Why do you think the doctors wouldn't do it? Well, the doctors wouldn't do it for the same reason we shouldn't put insecticidal seed treatments on soybeans. That strep inside my son probably would have developed resistance to those antibiotics if we'd have kept him on them all the time. We really need to go back to IPM, taking a systems level approach, thinking beyond just the one crop that we're farming, scouting and treating at threshold, and choosing the right insecticide for the right insect. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, ddreisig@ncsu.edu. Thank you.